We started last week a kind of a review to bring us up to speed where we left off when we finished 2 Kings, and that'll kind of round out this quarter. We actually talked a little bit about the Pentateuch, even though that's not technically our focus of study in Hebrew history. It technically begins in Joshua. Yes, Joshua. I just went blank there for a second. Technically begins in the book of Joshua, but we did back up into the Pentateuch just to sort of get the background coming out of Egypt and all of that. And then we left off with the book of Joshua. We started just a little bit talking about the book of Judges, made some comparison. I'll remind you of those. Joshua is, basically a book of great joy. Judges is a book of great sadness, spiritually speaking. Joshua is a book of victory. Judges is a book of defeat. Joshua is a book of, you see Israel. There's the instance with Ai, obviously that was a problem. And it's not to say that everybody was perfect in the book of Joshua, but for the most part, for the vast majority of the book, Joshua is a book of obedience. Judges is a book of disobedience. Joshua is a book of faithfulness to God. Judges is a book of unfaithfulness to God. Joshua is a book of progress. Judges is decline. Joshua's possession of the land. Judges is oppression in the land. Joshua is a book of faith. Judges is a book of unbelief. Joshua is a book of freedom. Judges is a book of bondage. Joshua is a book of the certainty of God's promises, and Judges is a book about the certainty of God's warnings. Very different books, as you can see. And if you've studied those and if you recall that study, you know they are very, very different. Well, let's talk about the book of Judges. Judges records from Joshua to the death of Samuel, I guess really more like the death of Samson. Easy to get those confused, right? Sam, if you just call him Sam for short. That's a tough crowd, Robert. You did say something last week about me making my joke, so I guess I have to just move on from that. But stick to my day job, huh? But Samson is who I'm trying to say, not Samuel. It goes to the death of Samson. And now, Samson's death is 1631 of Judges. If you know the book of Judges at all, you know that's not the end of the book of Judges. But if you recall from that study, chapter 17 through the end of the book is what we called sort of like, it wouldn't be an appendix, I guess it would be appendices, sort of almost like case studies in what things were like during the days of the Judges. So those last 5 chapters, they record events taking place. We don't really know. It's kind of an unknown period of time, and that's why I say a lot of people call it like appendices, because there's not really a time given, not a particular judge mentioned, and so we don't know exactly when those took place, but it is sometime during that history, and it's almost like God is saying, you want to know what things were like during that time period? You want to know what it's, kind of how dark sometimes it got with people spiritually? Here are a couple of case studies for you. So that's those last, but the historical part records from the death of Joshua to the death of Samson. Samuel's death is later on in the book of 1 Samuel. Purposes of the book of Judges, it shows the history of Israel after the death of Joshua. It shows the faithfulness of God in comparison to the unfaithfulness of the Israelites. There are many times within the book of Judges when they are unfaithful, God still is faithful. And of course, the book also shows and reminds us all the horrible consequences of rejecting God. Outline of the book, we mentioned this a little bit already, but the events that take place immediately after the death of Joshua, this will be chapter 1, verse 1, through about chapter 3, verse 6. This is kind of surrounding right after Joshua dies. What's going on? Then the second section would be chapter 3, verse 7, all the way to the end of chapter 16. That's the big section of the book. And that's the Judges, the period of the Judges. That's kind of giving you Some judges, you get very little information. Some judges, you get almost zero information, just kind of, here he was, he judged for 4 years or whatever. Some judges, like Samson, I think Samson is probably the one we get the most information on. Yeah, probably so. That's just off the top of my head without counting the verses or whatever, but probably Samson would be the most. But different amounts in there. So we're told about these judges. By the way, does anybody remember from our study, what is another term for the judges that probably is a better term to refer to these men and one woman? Champion. We think of a judge, and we think somebody who's going to, at least ostensibly is fair, upright. But these judges weren't all, many of them were, but these weren't all righteous people as far as overall. We know that, they're all going to make mistakes. But sometimes, especially like Samson is one, sometimes I read about Samson and you just kind of shake your head. What are you thinking, Samson? What are you doing? Well, these are champions. They're not necessarily spiritual leaders. And you see that, and sometimes we look at their conduct and we go, well, how could God choose this man to be a spiritual leader? That's not their job. That's not what they were raised up for. That God raised them up to be deliverers, champions. So you have to remember that. Important people in this book, of course, are your judges, and we'll talk about them. We're probably going to move on. I say we're going to talk about them, but I got to keep an eye on the time because I want to get through all of our reviews. So I probably won't talk about the judges individually. Barak is another one. Where does Barak come in, by the way? I know I'm getting back into a time that we've long since left behind in our study. Barak worked in conjunction with Deborah. I think some people got that, so that's good memory. Barak was supposed to be the champion, and he says to Deborah, well, I'll go if you'll go with me, and she says, well, I'll go, but you're not going to get the credit for the victory. And so she goes and helps to judge or champion the people. The writer of this book is unknown. Some people believe it was Samuel. It was definitely written before David conquered Jerusalem. By the way, what do we often call this book, the book of Judges? Does anybody remember this one? The Dark Ages of Israel. We often refer to it. A lot of scholars, a lot of Bible students refer to this as the Dark Ages of Israel. It certainly is a fitting moniker. I'm looking, I got so many notes, but I know I don't have time to go through them all. Remember, Israel served God all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. And we sometimes say it's not meant to be a pessimistic thing or anything, but it's just the reality of it. Apostasy many times is just a generation away. And that's what happened here. You had the generation of Joshua's peers, the generation of the elders that outlived Joshua, and then the next generation comes along, and somewhere along the way, I don't know if somebody forgot to teach or if they taught and the people just didn't listen, but they forgot about God. And that plunged them into a dark ages. And that's the importance of teaching our children, our grandchildren, each generation about God. And I learned this more and more as a preacher because sometimes I used to get frustrated sometimes as a preacher. Somebody would say, I'd like to hear a lesson about such and such. And I'm thinking, as a preacher, you study your lessons a lot more. And I know that as a preacher, you remember them a lot more probably than folks that are sitting in the pew and listening to them. Although sometimes I can't remember what I preached last week. But the content of those sermons, and somebody may say, I'd like to hear a sermon about something, and I may remember to myself, man, I just preached a sermon on that. How are they going to ask a question about something I just preached on? Well, then I go and look, and it's been 2, 3, 4 years ago. And even then, I would sometimes say, a few years back, I'd sometimes say to myself, well, how could you, I preached this sermon, but then I got to thinking to myself, well, you think about all the times in Scripture when God reminds. There's a song we sing. I can't remember the name of the song, but there's a line in there that says, remember I'm human, and humans forget. So remind me, dear Lord. There's something to be said for that. We need to be reminded over and over again. And there are various reasons for that. Sometimes it's a new generation coming along that Sometimes I've even heard some preachers say, well, I preach on baptism. I do that about once every 5 years, maybe every 10 years. What? I preach on the one church. I only do that every 7 to 8 years. Why? Well, everybody knows that. But how long if we just assume everybody knows it until everybody doesn't know it? Because it's not getting preached and taught. So there are things that we need to be reminded of because we just need to be reminded. We're humans and we forget. Number 2, there's a new generation. Number 3, what about when somebody new obeys the gospel? Somebody becomes a Christian. Now they may not be a new generation physically, but it's a new generation spiritually, and they're a babe in Christ. And so they need to have these things taught and reinforced. So memory, we forget, and things need to be repeated. But that generation, for whatever reason, they forgot about God. By the way, what's the cycle in Judges? I know we've talked about this numerous times, but rebellion, punishment, repentance, deliverance. I mean, in 4 words, do what? Mercy. You see that in God's deliverance. You could sum it up in 4 words, that cycle. They would rebel against God, and 99 times out of 100, this involved their serving idols in some way. And so God, just as he promised he would, he warned them. He allows them to be oppressed by, and of course, this is the irony of it. The people that oppressed them never should have been there. They were told to drive out the inhabitants of the land because this was a judgment from God for their idolatry, right? But they didn't do that. And so God says in the very beginning of the book, they're going to be thorns in your side. And so when they would turn their backs on God, God would allow them to be oppressed. This would go on sometimes for a little while, sometimes for a long while. And finally, they would come to their senses, kind of like the prodigal son in the far country. He came to himself. Finally, they'd come to themselves and they'd say, hey, you know what? These idols, they're not doing us any good. Let's cry out to the true God of heaven for help. And they would turn back to God in repentance, cry out to him for help, and then God would raise up a champion, a judge, who would come and deliver them. And they would serve, again, sometimes they would serve God for a decent little while. Sometimes they would very quickly go back into that idolatry and so on. Remember also, and we mentioned this several times when we studied the book, the judges are not all concurrent. Subsequent, I think is the word I'm looking for. Concurrent is together. That's what I'm trying to say they are. In other words, it's not always just, well, here's this judge, and he served, and then here comes the next one. Sometimes they overlap. And you say, well, how's that possible? Different geographical regions. Sometimes a judge, is not a judge over this united nation of Israel. He's judging, championing for God in a specific area, geographical area or region. And so you see that many times. That's why, in fact, sometimes you'll see people criticize and maybe have a beef with the book of Judges. They'll say, well, the timing doesn't work out. The chronology doesn't work out. Well, it doesn't if you're trying to make them all just one right after the other. But when you understand that they were sometimes overlapping, then it does. The theme of the book, of course, is in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. We remember Deborah, she was the one who was helped by Barak. Barak was supposed to be the judge, and he wouldn't step up. We remember Gideon, his army of only 300 men. We remember Samson for his strength. I don't know about you, but I remember Samson for his foolishness sometimes with Delilah. Just very kind of, what is he doing? Jephthah, the vow that he made, a very rash vow. And we talked about that, by the way, that no indication that he sacrificed his daughter. Seems to be a vow of that she ended up being a perpetual virgin. She never married. Then you come to the book of Ruth. I could talk about Judges the whole class. That's a really one of my favorite books of the Bible. The book of Ruth is recording history that takes place within the period of the book of Judges, as you recall. These events take place over a period of about 10 years. Well, not a huge long period, but not exactly a short period either. All the events recorded take place either in Bethlehem or Moab. As it starts off, there's a famine. They go to Moab, end up coming back to Bethlehem. Purposes of the book of Ruth, it shows the Israelites that God cares for, and it shows us as well. God cares for and receives not only Jews but Gentiles as well. Ruth, of course, was a Moabite, and you may recall she's in the genealogy of Jesus. The book also has as its purpose to show the background, part of the background at least, and the ancestors of King David. King David, I'm going to be talking, and I guess it'll be a couple weeks. It's the second week of my stay in Costa Rica. I'm supposed to be teaching a class at night, each night that week, on archaeology. And you may or may not remember this from our Science in the Bible series, but one of those lessons was on archaeology. And some skeptics, critics would say, David is this made-up king. There was no archaeological evidence. And there's a fallacy in archaeology of trying to argue from silence. Well, if this were real, we would have archaeological evidence. Well, that's a fallacy, because it may just be that you haven't discovered it yet. And so many times, critics are left eating crow, as we say, because they were arguing from silence, and then the evidence does come to light. And this is one of those examples. People would say, it's like, the British have their King Arthur, the Jews had their King David. Any of these mythical kings you can think of, they kind of compare David to that. No archaeological evidence. If he was real, we'd find archaeological evidence. Well, they did. They found archaeological evidence, and you see that term used throughout the Old Testament scriptures of the household of David, the lineage of David. And of course, when Jesus comes along, he's shown to be of that lineage, which was prophesied. The Messiah would come from the lineage of David. If you want a very brief outline of the book, you can just go chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. Those are your divisions. Naomi goes to Moab, and she later returns to Bethlehem with Ruth along with her. That's chapter 1. She went to Moab with her husband because of a famine. They go there. The husband dies. Her two sons married Moabite women. The two sons died. And so she decides to go back home, Naomi does, back home to Bethlehem. And she tells the girls, I don't have any more sons, even if I had a son right now. If I could have a husband and have a child like right now, are you going to wait around for him to be old enough to be marriageable age? So just go back home to your people and live your life and find a husband. And of course, you recall from the end of chapter 1, Ruth says, I'm not leaving you. Where you go, I'll go. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. And she says, nothing but death's going to part me from you. And so it's a great bond there between Ruth and Naomi. Then you get into chapter 2. Ruth is going to harvest barley in the field of Boaz. Naomi's kind of nudging her in that direction. Naomi's, every time I read this book, I think Naomi plays a little bit of matchmaker, it seems like. But Ruth will go and harvest barley in the field of Boaz. And again, you may recall from our studies, this was a law in the law of Moses. When you reap your field, you don't go over it twice. You don't even go to the corners of the field. Why? That was for the poor. You leave that for people who are in need. And so here's Ruth. They're poor. They're in need. And so they go. And Boaz, he sees this pretty lady, and he starts to take notice, right? And he says, hey, fellas, make sure you leave a little extra. Drop some handfuls on purpose. Leave plenty for her. I want to make sure she has enough. And so he took notice of her. And then in chapter 3, you have there's a lot summed up here just to say Ruth asked Boaz to marry her, but that's the long and short of it. Ruth and Boaz get married in chapter 4, and then they have a son, Obed, who had a son whose name was Jesse, who had a son whose name was David. And that's one of the big purposes of the book, as we said. It shows the lineage of David. We don't know who wrote this book. It was written after the birth of King David, obviously, because that's detailed in the end of the book. Ruth and Esther are the only two books in your Bible that are named after women. I love I love Ruth coming right on the heels of the book of Judges, because if Judges is the dark ages, Ruth is showing us that not everybody was caught up in selfish, sinful behavior. There were some bright spots in those dark ages of Israel's history. And Ruth was just as good as they come. And Boaz, look at the character and the integrity of Boaz, and you see that not everybody was just doing what was right in his own eyes. The nation, for the most part, had sunk into a dark ages, but there were bright spots. And that's encouraging to me, to know that if even, there are bad things going on in our own nation. Everything's not great always in our nation. But you and I can serve God. We can be faithful. It's not to say it's always going to be easy, but we can do it. And so I learned that from the book of Ruth. There's so much more I want to say about Ruth. I'm going to move on. Here's a comparison Frank done from his book, Know Your Bible, a comparison between Judges and Ruth. And this is kind of another, like we did with Judges and Joshua. But, again, you see such a contrast here. In Judges, it's basically, for the most part, overall unfaithfulness, right? But in Ruth, you see faithfulness emphasized. Ruth, Boaz, Naomi, faithful, strong servants of God. Judges, you see an emphasis on, not in a good way, but you see pointed out over and over again, immorality. And sometimes gross immorality, as you see in one of those appendices of the book there in the later chapters. But in Ruth, there's an emphasis on purity. The purity, the piety of Ruth, Boaz, Naomi. Judges is all about battlefields. Ruth is all about harvest fields. In Judges, you hear the warriors shout. In Ruth, you hear the harvester's song. In Judges, there's confusion and distress. In Ruth, peace and rest. Judges is a book about spiritual darkness. Ruth is a book about spiritual light. That's pretty interesting. By the way, I think we pointed this out in our class when we studied some of the archaeological stuff from the Biblical History Center in LaGrange. But one of the things that I always wondered when I would read the book of Ruth, it would say something about, there's one of these things where Gideon, what's his name? Boaz, and his men are sleeping at the threshing floor. Like, what is that about? Does anybody remember from our study of the Biblical History Center what we know now? And this is not necessarily archaeological, it's more, I guess, historical, but there is some archaeological evidence that backs it up as well. Does anybody remember why that was the case? Yeah, it's protecting it. Sometimes people come along and steal your harvest, right? I mean, there were thieves back then, same as there are thieves now. And it was very valuable. That's your livelihood. So when they're reaping the fields, it was very common to sleep at the threshing floor during the harvest season. And this would go on for a period of time. It's not just, it's not where you're going to live, but during harvest time, it's any farmer will tell you, even now with all of our modern conveniences, it's a busy time. And one of the ways that they would help protect their crop was they would sleep many times at the threshing floor. All right, let's talk about 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel records a history from the birth of Samuel in chapter 1 to the death of Saul in chapter 31. You have two periods of history here that are kind of, not overlapping, but they're described. The tail end of the period of the Judges and the beginning of the period of the United Kingdom. This is about 90 to 100 years of history. You have the judges Eli and Samuel. Those will be your last two judges. And then King Saul, of course, reigns for 40 years. Purposes of the book of 1 Samuel, it records a transition. Well, how did we go from judges to the United Kingdom? Well, 1 Samuel is going to help us answer that question. It records the establishment of the Hebrew monarchy. It also shows that when Israel asked for an earthly king, what were they doing in reality? They were in reality rejecting the one king they had, who was the only king they ever needed, and that was God. If you want an outline of this book, you can really break it down very basically into three sections. the birth and the early work of Samuel. That's your first 7 chapters. Remember, Hannah prayed for a baby. God gave her Samuel. She said, if you will give me a son, Lord, I will give him back to you. And that's exactly what she did. And he served Eli at the temple. So the birth and early work of Samuel, first 7 chapters. Chapters 8 through 15, Samuel and Saul. After the incident with the Amalekites, Saul was told to go and destroy them utterly. He saved Agag the king. He saved the best of the flocks and the herds. And, oh, well, I was going to sacrifice them to God. And he says, to obey is better than sacrifice. But after chapter 15, Samuel has no more dealings with Saul. And that's by God's design. God was very... Samuel would have been your last judge, yes. God was very, to use a term that my mom would sometimes use with me, God was very put out with Saul. Saul started off humble. He was little in his own eyes, is the way Samuel puts it at one point, and of course God speaking through Samuel. When you were little in your own eyes, you were made captain over the thousands of Israel. But it kind of, we would use the expression, it went to his head. He started reading his own press clippings, and all of a sudden he thinks he is something else. And he doesn't follow God faithfully. So God took the kingdom away from Saul. And then the last several chapters, chapters 16 through 31, are Saul and David. Saul has seen David. David came out, he killed the giant, and he goes to battle, and he's serving Saul. David is. But the people are saying, well, Saul's killed his thousands, but David's killed his 10,000s. And Saul was just eaten up with jealousy over that. Later on, of course, he realizes the kingdom is going to David. And so now he can think of, well, all that's left for me to do is just to kill David. That's what he wants to do. He wants to kill David. And so those chapters, he's after David. And then finally, of course, Saul dies in a battle with the Philistines. Important people in this book: Eli, Samuel, Saul, David, Jonathan. Eli and Samuel being the last 2 judges. Saul and David being, David won't be king in this book, but he's going to be the next king, Saul being the first. Jonathan, of course, is Saul's son. A lot of things we could note as far as teachings and verses and themes that we might note. How are we doing on time? Probably, yeah, we're running low. Oh, by the way, the writer of this book is uncertain. Some people think Samuel wrote the first 24 chapters. Maybe not after that because of his death. Again, by inspiration, he could have written even about stuff that happens after his death. But it's probable that an inspired prophet like Nathan or Gad came along and finished that part. Because, as you will recall also from our study, there was no 1st and 2nd Samuel originally. There was just Samuel. So there's a lot more history to be recorded after the death of Samuel. Probably Nathan or Gad, these were both inspired prophets, so they certainly could have sat down and written by inspiration the rest of the book. Maybe that Samuel wrote up to a certain point and then one of them took over. Maybe one of them wrote the whole thing, but either way, it's inspired of God, and we understand that. I've got to call some stuff out here. So much we could say about Samuel, Saul, and David, really. David is recorded, we pointed this out, I'm pretty sure, in our class, but it's interesting to note, Saul was, when the people cried out for a king, they rejected God as their king. Saul was whose choice? It was the people's choice. David was God's choice. God says, I'm picking the next king. There's going to be no, not that there was an election before, but there's going to be no popular vote. And he says, Saul was kind of a be careful what you ask for because you just might get it example. They wanted a champion, a military leader, somebody to go out and lead our troops in battle, and they got it. They forgot to ask, give us a king who's got a good heart. He's kind, he's compassionate. No, they want somebody to go out who's tall, dark, and handsome, as we use that terminology. Well, be careful what you ask for. But with David, God says, I've found me a man after my own heart. It's not to say David was perfect, but he was a man who wanted to follow God. And oh, by the way, he was also not to be taken lightly in battle either. Just ask Absalom, many other, ask Goliath. There are so many examples where we learn David was not a wimp by any stretch. Yeah, in fact, that God says when David wanted to build a house for the Lord, God says one of the reasons God said no was you've had a lot of bloodshed under your reign, David. And so, but David was far different in character than Saul. So you get into 2 Samuel and you see a continuation of this history. It's going to pick up with, right after the death of Saul. You're going to see David take over. There's a brief period of civil war. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, some people wanted to set him up to be king, and he was king over the better part of the kingdom, at least for a short time. David was king in Hebron, chapters 1 through 4. In fact, you want the divisions, you want to outline the book. Chapters 1 through 4, you have David as king over Judah in Hebron. And then chapters 5 through 10, you have the glorious period of David's reign over all Israel. This is kind of the zenith of David's reign. And it all sort of goes downhill in chapter 11, because why? Yeah, one word, sin. David, for whatever reason, is not out with his troops. He's on the rooftop. He sees a woman. He sins for her. He commits adultery. Long story short, he ends up having her husband murdered, takes her as his wife, and it just seems like he's just trying to sweep the whole thing under the rug. But God knew, and so God sends Nathan to him to confront him. And to his credit, when he was confronted, he owned up to it. He said, I've sinned. He made things right, but God says there are some serious consequences that will last for the rest of your days. The sword will never depart from your house. And that's a big turning point in David's reign. It's a big turning point in the book. So chapters 11 through 19, you have David's sin with Bathsheba and all the troubles in his household as a consequence of that sin. And then 20 through 24 of 2 Samuel detail the last years of David's life and also the internal problems within the nation of Israel. So this book records the history of David's rule over Israel. You have Saul's reign in 1 Samuel, David's reign in 2 Samuel. It shows that David and Israel overcame when they lived by faith, but they faced great difficulties when they sinned. The book ends, by the way, with David numbering the people in chapter 24, presumptuously numbering the people. And he comes to do what? Absalom came into Jerusalem and they vacated the city. I believe the Bible doesn't tell us exactly why. I don't think it was fear of his son and his forces. David was a military man. I think it's probably to avoid what we would call collateral damage. I think it was to spare Jerusalem from being a site of battle. Because where did they, as you recall, where did they end up fighting? Out in the woods, right? Well, a lot less civilian casualty when you're fighting out in the woods, a lot less collateral damage from buildings and things like that. Not that they're using bombs, but there still were things would get destroyed. And I think that's why David vacated the city. Either way, he did vacate the capital. And he went kind of on the run from Absalom. And Absalom does come in and set himself up as king, but he never was. He was just... Yeah, now that's at the very beginning of 2 Samuel. Yeah, so Ishbosheth does set himself up as king, and they make him king. It was for a period of just a couple of years, as I recall. I don't think I have that in my notes here. 2 years, yeah. 2 years. And what happened was that Abner was Ishbosheth's right-hand man, his big general. And Abner defected. Ishbosheth insulted him. He defected to David. And once he defected to David, he was just too important. It'd be kind of like Robert E. Lee from the South defecting to the North. That would have just effectively probably ended the Civil War. David? Ishbosheth? I don't remember. Maybe about 40. No, just a couple of years. And when Abner defected, that, again, that effectively ended that. Ishbosheth was not God's king, and that was the whole point here, was that he was never He was never God's choice for king. David was the one anointed by God, but Ishbosheth does eventually. He ends up being murdered by some of his own men, and they come to David, and they bring his head. And David rewarded them really well, didn't he? No, I see some heads going like this. I do this to my kids sometimes. I say the opposite just to see if they're paying attention and if they know. So sometimes we do that in Bible time. But yeah, I see some heads going like, no, I don't think so. No, that's not how it worked. He rewarded them, but he rewarded them with death. He said, you know, you had no right to do that. That was not the right thing to do. This was the son of King Saul. He was the child of God's anointed. You know, he wouldn't. David had two opportunities to very easily he could have killed Saul, but he wouldn't because he said that's God's anointed. And when somebody came to him to tell him about Saul's death, all excited, hey, guess what? Your number one enemy is dead. And I did it. I killed him. And he says, you should have been afraid to even lift your hand against God's anointed. And these guys came and they said, look, hey, Ishbosheth reigns over. You can take over the whole kingdom now, David, because look here, we got his head. And he says, you think you're going to come and get a reward from me for that? He says, your reward is you're going to reap what you've sown. So that's David again. He was not a man to be taken lightly. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a good man, but he did not mess around for sure. During this book, or within this book, chapter 7, you have a messianic prophecy. David says, I want to build God a house. Nathan first tells him, or is it Gad? Anyways, one of those. Nathan. No. I'm thinking this. Anyway, it was neither Nathan or Gad. I get them confused sometimes. It says, go ahead, build the house. And God sends the prophet back to David and says, no, you're not going to build the house. Too much bloodshed. And he says, your son's going to build me a house. However, God says, I'm going to do what? I'm going to build you a house. But it's not a brick and mortar house. It's a spiritual house. It's a prophecy of the Messiah. So that kingdom is going to be never ending. As we talked about just a moment ago, Absalom's son rebelled against him. This is part of the consequence for his sin with Bathsheba. David continued to love Absalom. In fact, even after that battle was over and Absalom was killed, David just continues to mope and moan and groan. And I'm not trying to be hard on David because I imagine just about any of us, if it were our son, would be the same way. But Joab comes to him at one point and says, you better quit this whining because we've got a victory. You're back on the throne. Your rebellious heathen son has finally been put down, and all you can do is moan and groan, and the people, they're just they're basically in a state of depression. We've won a victory, and if you don't go out there and act like we just won a victory, Joab says, I'm gonna defect. And so David did go. He goes, and sometimes even in the midst of grief, we have to put on not a happy face, I guess, but sometimes you have to carry on with duty. And that's what David does. But that was a difficult time for him. But boy, Absalom was a really rebellious son. And he needed to be dealt with. Joab, he didn't exactly deal with him honorably. Absalom is caught in a tree by his hair. He had that long, flowing, thick hair. He's caught in a tree or suspended. And there's evidence that maybe what had happened was he was kind of suspended, caught between limbs, and it might have been more his head, but with a big, thick head of hair, it certainly could have been his hair. It would have worked either way. But Abner comes along and he kills him. He thrusts a spear right through him. And, I sort of understand that from Abner's standpoint. This is an enemy combatant. But I also understand that from David's standpoint. Did we just get the first and second bell on one? We already had the first bell? I didn't hear that. It's good night. Yeah, I was too busy talking. Didn't he know I wasn't done? First and Second Kings, we're a little more familiar with, hopefully, because we've covered those more recently. But you're looking at the history of the rest of the history of the United Kingdom. First Kings really centers around Solomon's reign, and we talked about that and Solomon's glory and Solomon's mistakes. And then when you get to Second Kings, you learn about, the latter part of First Kings and also into Second Kings, how the kingdom divided, how we came to have the kingdom of Israel in the north, Judah in the south, and how we came to have the kingdoms in captivity. The northern kingdom eventually fell due to their sin to Assyria. And as we closed out the book of 2 Kings, the southern kingdom eventually fell due to their sins to the nation of Babylon. And that brings us down to where we left off with first and second, or the end of 2 Kings. I knew I'd run out of time, but I knew 1st and 2 Kings were probably the most familiar to us because that's the most recent. But thank you very much. We will have a break before our worship, and we'll pick up with our new quarter. We'll look at another study. Thank you.